This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bord-Deronay. The two of us are partners at the office and, of course, hosts of this show. And today we are going to answer a question from a listener that is about architectural concepts. Sponsors. If you need to get 2D or 3D as-built of a project, then you should check out Canvas, an iPhone and iPad app. Here's how it works. Using Canvas, you scan the house, and then Canvas processes the scan to produce the as-built automatically, so you don't have to do any measuring. The file formats include ArchiCAD, Revit, AutoCAD, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. Canvas has been a great tool for us, and I know many of you will find it helpful, so check them out by visiting canvas.io/SSP or click the link in our show notes to schedule a demo and get your first as-built for free. Stop juggling multiple pieces of software and struggling with design-unfriendly spreadsheets. Programma, built by designers for designers, provides an integrated suite of tools for every phase of your project, from mood boards to advanced specification tools, procurement tracking to project management. Seamlessly integrated, easily shareable, and always current, Programma reduces redundancy and minimizes costly errors. Join Interior Design movers and shakers by starting for free at programma.design/secondstudio. Experience the difference with Programma, software built for interior design workflows.
If you're looking for an ultra-fast and robust BIM computer program for architecture and or interior design, then we suggest you check out ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD leads the industry by enabling architecture and interior design firms around the world to 3D design, supported by innovative technology that expands as far as the imagination can stretch. As ArchiCAD continues to evolve with technological advances, architects can push that technology to their advantage while working in an accurate model. We absolutely love ArchiCAD, and you can try the program for free, fully functioning, if you click the link in our episode notes.
This is The Second Studio with myself and Marina. Here we go. Today we are going to answer a question from a listener that is about architectural concepts. Okay, here's the question from the listener. I'm currently a senior interior architect student at a college in Massachusetts. I'll leave the college unnamed. We are currently in the conceptual stage of our thesis projects working on 2D and 3D parties. I have always questioned why parties and all this conceptual thinking is pressed so aggressively in school, but in my experience through internships does not carry over into the field. I wanted to reach out and hear your thoughts on conceptual thinking and how that carries over or doesn't from school to the real world. I've completed 3 internships now and have not personally ever experienced conceptual thinking in the field. Is it common to skip this step in the design process, or is it a firm-by-firm basis?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I think I've had that same question coming from a student back when I was part of that Georgia Tech panel. Was it last year?
I don't remember.
One of the students in the assembly asked the same things, like, why do we need conceptual thinking? Like, what do we need to learn about, or I think his question was more like, what do we need to learn about the old stuff, from the Greek and all of that stuff, right? Which
that's pretty different, but yeah.
It's different, but it's kind of in the same, in some ways it's similar. I think parties are important and conceptual thinking is important because it's not so much about, let's say, I think the party itself. It's more about learning how to have a process of thinking, how to articulate your thoughts in a way that makes sense and eventually translate to a relevant answer to the design problem that was approached to you.
Okay.
So it's very important in school because that's where you're learning your design skills, right? So that kind of brain skill of thinking conceptually in a space that doesn't exist is in your head with just words and an abstract terminology and random ideas, right? It's only a process that you can experience, and it's not something that's easily teachable, I would say, right? So I think that's also why school is putting a strong emphasis on that, is that it's not something you're going to learn in the real world. I mean, you might, but it's not easy to learn.
So there's a couple things I think you're saying. So are you stating that it's the actual concept and the partie, which we're just going to kind of assume folks listening know what a partie is, that the actual concept and partie is not so important, but it's more of the learning of how to think?
Well, I think, in my opinion, the big picture is that, the concept of party could be anything, right?
Okay.
But I think what matters the most is how did you get there? That's the most interesting part of it. And eventually, the how did you get there will lead you the best way you go through that thinking process, the best party and concept you will come up with, right? So it's not so much about focusing on the result when you go through the process. It's more about thinking about the process itself.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. I just want to clarify though, are you stating, because there's two sides to this, there's the academic side and there's the professional side. Are you saying that in both spaces, but let's say in the professional setting, it's not important to have a concept? Or are you saying that in school, the reason why you learn this in school is because it is important and there's not really another space and time that you're going to learn?
Yeah, no, they're both important, and maybe the concept and the party is more important when you're working. But in school, the actual concept or party is not as important. Like, I think students have a tendency to put too much pressure on finding like the best concept, the best party. But really, I think the training in school and the emphasis on conceptual thinking isn't so much about like who's going to come up with the best concept. It's very much like how are you going to define your conceptual thinking process to get there.
Okay, I see what you did, Mr. Miyagi. Okay, you've confused me, but I understand. So you're saying that when it comes to producing architecture, so the first question that's kind of embedded within his questions is whether or not a concept is valid at all. Do we need concepts and parties in actual buildings? That's kind of inherent in his text. And your answer is yes, we do need those things.
Yeah, we can dive into that, second part of it.
Okay, so your answer is yes, and you're saying that when you're a student, you have to learn how to do that. And as a teaching methodology and as a learning methodology, it's not to put too much pressure on oneself to find, like you said, the perfect idea. It's more about discovering your way of thinking and a way of designing it. And
I think because, over the course of your, years in school, like your 4 or 5 years in school, like how many projects are you working on? Not every single project is going to have great concept or a great party.
Speak for yourself.
Right? No, but it's more about the practice, like practicing that skill and developing that skill that matters, I think.
Yeah.
Rather than like aiming for the coolest thing you can come up with for your project. Like that's not the goal. Because you might do great on that one, but if you can repeat that thinking process and that conceptual thinking on other projects, then you fail at learning that skill.
If you cannot. Cannot. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, you really Tarantino this thing. You skipped over all of the big question, just went right for the end of.
That's what I do,
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, I think. So I have some thoughts to I think this recording is going to be kind of scattered, but it's fine.
Well, you asked me to start.
There's another reason why that conceptual thinking is more prevalent in the academic space and less prevalent in the professional space. And I'm not saying that this reason validates the reality. It's just these are the factors. It's because in the academic setting, as a student, when you're designing a building, when you get to third year or so, you are not fully designing a real building. There's a lot of constraints and practical issues and many other things that come into factor when you're doing a real building that you don't consider when you're a student. They're off the table.
Yeah.
Budget, a lot of times, even things like zoning and setbacks get kind of squishy for the sake of education. Constructability goes out the window. Structural feasibility goes out the window somewhat entirely. Schedules, a lot of things, coordination with other people, like 12 different things, just not really central to a student project. So
yeah, because I mean, you have, in school you do every single project up to like maybe the concept design phase. You never go beyond that.
So what that means also is that, in a sense, the absence of all of those things allows for more space in the process of the project. And that space gets filled in with conceptual thinking, like the core fundamental design thinking, we can also call it, occupies that space that's left over during the early design phases. So even in real life, when we are doing concept design and schematic design, which is, again, very close to what students do, we are still thinking about the real factors, because you can't draw stuff that's not going to get built. And again, in school, that doesn't exist, so that extra space gets filled in with conceptual thinking. Now, if we flip over to the professional side, yes?
Well, but I think also, no, go for it.
Okay. If we flip over to the professional side, all of those other 12 factors that I mentioned are there. So in a sense, there's less space for conceptual thinking. I think that's one reason why this takes place. Again, I don't think it's an excuse. I think conceptual thinking should take place in a professional setting, but that's the reality. The thing is, architects are really good at responding to constraints, right? We don't do as well when we're just given total freedom. We have to invent constraints. And this is an issue, too, that students will face when they're students. It's really hard to look at a blank page and create something as anybody, right? So what happens in the real world, in the professional setting, there are a lot of constraints. There are so many constraints that you could very easily produce a good or decent or average building without thinking conceptually ever, right?
Yep.
Because those constraints, they kind of dictate the path for you.
Yeah, and actually it's very interesting what you're saying, because it clearly made me realize that, I mean, it's something that we know, but it really made me realize that when you are in school, if you take the life of a project from conceptual to, you hand the keys to the client, right? That's like the actual lifespan of a project before it's completely done and before it's even created. Well, if you look at it in school, yeah, you're only focusing on like that one tiny phase at the beginning that is the conceptual design phase of a project. And that's the only thing that you learn in school. You never go beyond those phases. Even if you look at some facade detail that are all made up because, in school you just create things for the sake of creating things and try and dive into doing some technical drawing this and there. But still, it's so conceptual, right? Because it's skipping all of the other phases and everything that's tied to these phases later on. So in a way, it makes sense that school will focus on those conceptual thinking and, party in school because that is the phase you're operating in.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like you cannot expect to be learning, like construction administration skills if you've never gone beyond that phase, right?
There's no building that's being built. Yeah.
Like you've never done coordination. It's just kind of like, I think we also have to put things back in context.
Well, but then the question is, okay, but in practice, there is a concept design phase, a schematic design phase. So why is it in a professional setting, when we have those phases, why is it that a lot of offices, I would say like 95% of them, 99% of them probably, don't have concepts, don't have parties, don't have these things?
So that's a very good question. And you're right. Like once you get into the real world, like the actual practice of architecture, the conceptual phase gets inundated with a lot of other things because you're operating in the real realm of things, right? So you cannot ignore everything completely until the next phase because it's just it's within you, you know, from like your experience, your knowledge. Like you can't remove knowledge out of your head but to think about project. It's already, it got into your brain.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Some offices don't really do conceptual thinking so much, and that's also because a lot of offices operate and work in a lot of different ways, and they have very different interests, and they have their very different approaches as to how they practice architecture. I mean, as we explained before, like you could take 10 different offices and they all run their practice and think about architecture or go about architecture in many very different colors, right? Like, so there is not one way to do things. Sometimes it comes from the types of project that they're working on. Sometimes it comes from the schedule, the clients. Sometimes it's just personal interest. They're not conceptual people. They're technical people and they're not interested in that.
But would you say, can you pass me a pen? This pen's dead. I keep trying to use it to take notes, but...
But that being said, I do think that any type of architecture office should still preserve some sort of conceptual thinking and do think about party, because otherwise... I'm not saying that, like doing like crazy, like abstract things that clients wouldn't understand is necessary. Like, no, your client, like you should explain those things to your client and it should make sense and it should make sense to the project, right? Okay. But I do think that by doing this small exercise at the beginning, you might be able to uncover a solution that is not just a response to the constraints that you were given, but is actually opening the door to something more than that. And I do think that's what architects usually bring. They're not just technicians. They're technicians with a very creative mind, and they can, weave things together and bring, poetic to technical problems and just bring that additional dimension to projects.
I think you're highlighting also one of the very intriguing and elusive aspects of design itself, which is this extremely close relationship between pragmatic problem solving and when I say pragmatic, I don't necessarily, it means anything that's pragmatic. It doesn't mean function necessarily. It could mean function, it could mean budget, it could mean tectonics, it could mean anything that's pragmatic. Between solving pragmatic issues and then creating poetry and thinking, quote, outside of the box. And those two, in my mind, are the way that I work, they're very, very closely related. Because I personally believe that if you ask a lot of architects, what is architecture? I would hope a fair number would say it's problem solving, which sounds very dry and kind of boring and kind of like 2 + 2 is 4. Okay, I've solved the problem. But another adjective I could add to that description of what architects do would be creative problem solving, which is kind of redundant because I think if you solve a problem correctly, you are being creative.
Yeah.
And the first thing you have to do is figure out what the problem is.
Yeah.
And this has been talked about on the show before, and it's always a delight when I hear our guests who are successful architects state basically the same thing. So, but anyway, so I think that if you look at all of the issues of a project, all of the issues, the pragmatic ones and the non-pragmatic ones, and those are the constraints, you could call them, or things you have to contend with. If you looked at them enough and you pull together enough of them and you allow yourself to kind of meander through this cloud of information, an interesting, unique idea that's, quote, outside of the box will arise. And that's the very close relationship that I was referring to. The challenge, though, is that so that can happen. It can also happen where if you look at all of these issues, but you don't have the right thinking mechanisms, right, to find a unique solution or an appropriate solution, you end up being just restrained by those issues. And you end up producing, okay, 2 + 2 is 4. Okay, that's going to be 4. Then 3 times 3 is 9. So that's going to be 9. And then 1 + 2 is 3. Okay, then I have a 4, a 3, and then a 9. And that's the solution. And you get stuck in that kind of framework. So I don't know where I was going with that, but I think that's also another reason why it's just less common in practice. And you had said that different architects practice differently, but that ideally an office would think conceptually, which I think is interesting because it's sort of...
Yeah, because otherwise what? You just respond to a constraint from the building code, the zoning code, what your client wants, and like, where is the creation? Where is the excitement?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some people are really excited just doing that, but like, did you really go to architecture school to end up just focusing on that? Like, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I feel like a lot of the students who enter architecture school, they have bigger dreams, right? And it's not because you start working that you have to like lose those things that excited you.
Yeah, yeah. You had mentioned also this idea that 90% of the architecture process, which let's say goes from schematic design-ish or mid-schematic design all the way through, when you're handing over the keys, like that's the percentage of the process, and concept design is like 10%. It's really, really small. You had mentioned the idea that 90% kind of like infiltrates the conceptual thinking and restrains a person. And I think it's an interesting way to put it. And I think it's true because if you think about it again, just kind of from a distance, if 90% of your time is spent doing these other things, it's going to impact that initial 10%, which is meant to be loose and wild and weird and in a lot of ways make no sense when you're thinking. And it's really difficult to kind of split those two. So,
and I think that's also why those things are not taught in school, because they would infiltrate, the capabilities of students to develop their design skills and their thinking skills.
And this goes back to something we said before in an earlier recording, that every person, it's human nature to want security. We're always looking for the answer, looking for security. And one of the skills that design and an architect has is to abandon that sensation. You have to learn how to let go of that, which is very difficult to do, and you have to constantly remind yourself to let go of that. And so in the school setting, I agree that's why it's not taught. A lot of those things aren't taught because students, when they're learning design, they want to grab onto anything that's going to give them security. And as soon as you tell them, well, you can focus on this sustainable technology that's new and hip or whatever, and the student will say, okay, great. Subconsciously, they will latch onto that and allow that to occupy 80%, 90% of their project because they found a nice and secure blanket to hide under.
Yeah.
Right. And they've not answered all the other issues because now they're just thinking about this technical thing. And I've seen it thousands of times in studios. It almost any student you give me will go that path naturally because it's human nature. The same thing happens in practice. I think it's very important in practice to, again, suspend disbelief is one way to describe it. It's also just to completely ignore things and write down ideas that don't make sense. It's fine, right?
Well, and I think also there is, like we talked about before, like when you're in like middle school, high school, junior high, you have to like do assignments.
Yeah,
right?
It's very task specific.
And it's task specific. You have to respond to get a good grade.
Yeah.
And there's kind of like the pressure of doing that. And I think, when you start working, it's the same thing. Like you're kind of like pressure to like do a good job, and you're focusing too much on the outcome and less on like how you're going to get there. I do think it's something to watch out for, because if you don't practice those conceptual thinking and design thinking enough, you're going to lose it, and then it's really hard to get back to it.
It is. That's why I think it's really important when you're in school to build a very strong foundation for that mode of thinking.
Yeah.
Because it's just there's like a 1% chance it's going to happen in practice, and so building off of the things we've said, it's also like if you're working at an office and you're working directly with the partners, let's say, there's a lot of like other real world stuff they have to contend with, like budgets and fees and getting paid on time and invoices and payroll and all this stuff. And it's very easy, and there's other stuff too as an adult. There's like insurance and it's all these things, right? And it's very easy to let all those things dictate a schedule and a kind of structured way of existing, and then to realize that I need to be very efficient to be successful in all of these constraints that are placed upon us. And the way we do that is to not waste time with doodling random stuff that would never ever be built and never ever make sense. Let's just jump to the thing that I know will work, will be a nice looking building, and we'll get paid for, and then we move on to the next. Now, I'm not saying that most architects think that actively, but I can guarantee it subconsciously it's there, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that hits us every day. All the things that I mentioned, and it's just, what it is really, it's counterintuitive to see all that stuff, recognize the seriousness of it, and just like forget about it. Just forget about it for like 3 hours and do this other exercise, which also, by the way, when you're doing concept design and you're sketching out these ideas, it may produce something fantastic. It may produce squat. It might produce nothing, right?
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think also the opposite is right too. Like offices who focus too much on the party and the conceptual thinking, it might be completely, their solution, their building proposal might be completely out of whack. It might make no sense at all to nobody, and in that case, like that was actually a huge waste of time, and you actually missed the point. And you have to know like how to dose the amount of conceptual thinking and emphasis on the party and all of that in practice, because you can spin your wheel for months doing that, and you can design something that only makes sense to you and your brain because you like just went down the rabbit hole on something and were not able to like say like, okay, look, I think I spent enough time on this. This is not going anywhere, or maybe this is going too far. I need to dial it back, to bring it back to something that makes more sense. And I think all of that takes practice. So
I think this is also why sometimes for offices, when they're hiring employees and those employees have just graduated, they expect them to produce different ideas in the office.
Yeah.
Right? It's always like the young talent with fresh ideas. It's kind of the cliche, but it's sort of true, right? That's I wouldn't say it's an easy way, but it's one way offices get back to that thinking, is just to introduce this
bringing fresh blood.
This other element that hasn't been worn down by all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is tricky. I mean, even the other day I was working on something, and I think we produced something that it made perfect sense. Really, you looked at it, it's like it's great. Just go, move forward, build it, build upon that design, and then get it built. But you know, after doing it for so long, and also when I was a student, I thought I was more on the conceptual side of things than anything else. So I can feel when something's not quite right, and that's a very vague thing. And I know for students, they're like, what does that mean? But you just know when you look at it, you just know this is not quite, something's not, it doesn't feel honest. And I've said this many times before, it just doesn't feel honest. It feels like we're missing something. It doesn't have that juice that makes me excited. It's something's missing. So it caused us to go back and kind of question everything. And I will say that it's a painful process. I think the conceptual design process, it does get easier because you know your mechanisms and you know, look, I've done this like, 30 times before. I know I can do it again. So because there's a track record, there's more comfort.
Yeah.
But the actual moment when you're in the concept design phase and you're sketching out stuff, the sensation, the subjective sensation is fear. It's that I don't think that ever really goes away. There's a little more comfort because I know I've done it before, but still, this one's new, and that's what if you approach projects the way that I think I do or we do, every project should be new, and there's always that you're on a cliff's edge, right? And you can stay on that cliff's edge and kind of do what you've done before, or you can just jump off of it. And are you going to fall or fly? We'll just have to see. It worked out before, but this is a different one, so we'll just see what happens.
And I think also that's why a lot of architects, in a way, decide to kind of like have a style, and kind of basically keep recycling the same design thinking and party, but just kind of like tweaking it slightly. And some people could say like they're just trying to perfecting their process or perfecting their ideas.
I think there's some truth to that.
Which I could see there is some truth to that. I also can see how that's totally bullshit, and it's just a way for them to hide and not taking that risk every time. Just reusing something that they know has worked before.
Yeah. And I think on that, I think that's also why that's another reason why some offices don't prioritize conceptual thinking. Maybe they did at the very beginning, at the birth of their office for the first 5 to 10 years even. But then after that, once they get into a groove and they know what they do, and let's say it's also for honest reasons, then why would they go backward and kind of rethink the whole foundation of what they've built up when they believe in it? I think that's part of it too. I personally, I think we'll see, but I think in 20 years from now, if I'm in that situation, I think I'd be bored out of my mind. I don't think I'd be interested in that. Everyone has their own tendencies toward things, whether it be formal things, material things, conceptual, whatever things. And I think one of the joys of doing architecture is it gives you the freedom to just try hard to push away from those.
Well, and try new things every time.
Yeah.
Like, again, if you think about your architectural career, like how many projects can you be working on and seeing through all the way through? Mm-hmm. Not a whole lot, right? So if you see just, various iterations of the same throughout, like I would also be bored.
Well, I think that this is another reason why conceptual thinking and the party and the concepts are less evident in offices is because of the clients and the marketing and all that kind of outside of practice. So once you become known for doing a project, or let's say you produce one project and it gets published and everyone knows that project, and what's going to happen is that for most people, most clients, when they see that project and they want to do their own house or their own multifamily building or whatever it is, and they call you up, they will expect something that's very close to what they've seen because they like it. So clients, a lot of times, not always, they choose architects. They choose architects based on their work, but even more specifically, based on how their work looks, right? So then, as an architect, let's say that's happened to you, and a client comes to you and says, okay, I want to do a project, and I really like this one that you did before. Can it be something similar? It's very unlikely you're going to find an architect to say no. You're like, absolutely. If it's a good budget, it's a good fee, and it's going to be a good project also, I'll be honest, it'll be a good project, and yes, I'll do it. And are we going to have the chance to like radically rethink the concepts of stuff in this project? Probably not, because so much has been already outlined by the previous one. And once that happens once, twice, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then suddenly you end up at a point where when you're hired, you are not expected to come up with something different. You're expected to deliver what you've done before. Give me silver potato chips. I want that.
Right. Well, for the most iconic, yeah, sure.
But even the smaller ones, right? It's
yeah,
like,
but
give me the white boxes.
But
Don't
I do
give me
feel
something.
like, I mean, I don't know, from experience, like, clients come to you with a very distinct idea of what they want, and then they go through the process with you, and that idea just kind of fades away because they're starting to see their own house and their own project takes form. And I do think there is room for things to change, even though at the beginning maybe they hired you for that big blue house that you did and they wanted that. Maybe throughout the process, they're discovering themselves too and discovering the project and forgetting about what they've seen before. They're just excited about what's to come. So I do think there is room for moving away from that. But it also comes from the architect. If the architect is like, okay, well, this person contacted me because they want a blue house, I'm going to do a blue house. Yeah, true. Okay, well, then, yeah, you're only going to be doing blue house in your career. Like, you've made that decision. You've never, like, questioned that or pushed that away.
To be honest, and this gets more to how we work with clients, I think that a lot of architects are too timid. I think that when a client approaches you and says, here are reference images, I want something like that, or I've saw this other project you did, I want something like that, same difference really. I think it's very easy for an architect to say, well, we could do that, but wouldn't you rather have me produce something that's going to be special and better than what I did before, and that's unique to you? And I think some clients will say, no, I want that thing. But I think a lot of clients will say, yeah, that sounds good. Let's try that. Let's go for that. And it's very easy for an architect to just fold and say, okay, yeah, fine. Because it's an easy path.
Yeah, and I think also there is two kinds of architect. There is the one that just like fall and do what the clients do and never question and never propose anything else. And then there is the kind of like more dictatorship architect who's like, this is my way and this is how things are done. And if you don't like it, basically like...
there's probably a middle ground in there.
Well, there is a middle ground, but I'm talking about the two extremes, right?
Yeah, okay.
Of course there is middle ground.
Yeah.
But, I've heard also a lot of people saying like, well, architects, they kind of have their way to do things. And it just sounds to me like,
well, look, it's
just non-negotiable.
It's a whole process, right? So it baffles me when there's a client who says, oh, I had this architect and it didn't turn out well. There's like all these things I don't like, and they list like 20 things, and some of those things are foundational. I mean, they're not like, oh, I don't like that color. It's like the whole layout doesn't make sense. And I'm like, how did this even happen? Because, and both sides are to blame. I would probably blame the architect more than the client. But it's not like we do all our work, we show it to you, and then that's it. And we're done. There's a lot of meetings during design. So there's a lot of opportunities for the client to reject stuff and plenty of opportunities for the architect to listen or to request feedback from the client. And if you're an architect and you don't do that, then you're a dick. You know what I mean? Like, no, it's silly because at every meeting, at all 50 meetings, you just constantly say, nope, sorry, nope. It's just always no. I don't know. It's not very interesting. I also think that, and this also talks about how different architects work with clients. I think if you understand people and you are interested in people, that becomes another ingredient that can be very, very, very interesting. And I personally think that's great. And I think it's really cool. And it's not to say, I want to be very clear, that's not to say that if you work in that manner, that you are just listening to the client, that you are just following what the client says. Absolutely not.
No, but it's a conversation.
You talk to them and you extract 100 bits of information and you find the one or two that you think are interesting and are relevant and important, and then you develop, then that becomes one of the other seeds in the mix.
And now a little break for our show sponsors. We're supported by Enscape. Enscape is a real-time visualization and VR tool that we personally use and recommend. And the reasons why we like it is that it's fast, realistic, and actually easy to use. The interface is great and they have a good library of components. It also renders in real time, which means that you don't have to waste time waiting for the image to be rendered to see what it's going to look like. It's also a plugin that works with all of the major 3D modeling program, and it's available for Mac and PC. So if you want to up your visualization and rendering game, I think you should look into Enscape. So make sure you click on the Enscape 3D link in our show notes for a free trial.
If you're starting to laser scan your renovation projects for accurate as-builts, you'll want to hear this. Imagine that you've been awarded a big project, but not surprisingly, your client hands over wonky CAD drawings from 17 years ago. No worries. Meet Integrated Projects, or IPX for short. IPX is a scan-to-BIM platform that converts your 3D point cloud file, which is produced from any major LiDAR camera, into standardized BIM and CAD files. The best part is that they lay out the price and turnaround time instantly. That means starting your interior renovation project on the 50-yard line with an accurate set of drawings in 3D and 2D. Click the IPX link in our show notes to launch the platform for free.
The Second Studio podcast is made possible by support from Autodesk. Autodesk has been part of the design conversation since 1982, providing the tools that help architects around the globe imagine and create beautifully designed, memorable buildings that people love and admire.
Autodesk supports the work of the Second Studio, bringing the architecture community together, sparking curiosity, and leading vibrant interviews with the industry's visionaries and thought leaders. The Second Studio works hard to carry the architecture conversation forward, and Autodesk is proud to support this podcast. Learn more about Autodesk by clicking the link in our show notes.
I was also thinking that, conceptual thinking is a great way for students, but also for professionals, to articulate their thoughts when they present a project.
To articulate their thoughts or articulate the project? Articulate their thoughts in the project.
Well, when you think about stuff and you think it over and over and you're thinking about different ways and you understand how you got from here to there and and why and this and that, you actually question and thought about all of it, right? I think it just helps present, let's say, design options or any design things to a client because you can explain how you got there, right? If you kind of skip and just went to the result, you miss all the steps that led you there. Therefore, how are you going to explain to the client what this option is better than this one, or how did you get to that option, right? And I think people will be surprised, but 9 out of 10 clients are interested in knowing why an option is better than the other, and how did you get to that option. Some clients might not be interested in the process at all, but most of them are very curious to know why is this better? Tell me, what can we do this? I thought maybe we could do that. Well, no, we can't because, we've tried it and it doesn't work because of this or that reason, right? But if you have missed all those steps, then it also makes the client question of your ability to come up with stuff because it has no foundation.
I want to ask you this also. So I think you can split what you said into two pieces in terms of client presentations and explaining things to people. There's explaining things that are, again, pragmatic and functional, and then there's explaining things that are conceptual. Now, to the listener's question and their point, most practices, they do explain things to the client, but they're only explaining budget stuff, schedule stuff, function stuff, utilities, utilitarian things, that kind of stuff, right? Very rarely does an office explain the conceptual things. One, they don't have a concept, but even they did, they don't bother explaining it. It's unfortunately common that for most offices to not think about concepts. And even if they're ones that they do, it's fairly common for them to just not explain it to the client because they think to themselves, well, I know the client's not interested and we're interested. So as long as we get it approved by the client, that's what matters. So I don't care about them understanding the concept. I just want it to get approved. So I'm going to talk about these other things as a way to kind of skip over the conceptual part because they don't care, and that will allow me to get the building done. At the same time, also, some architects will take an architectural concept or a thing that they have, and they will develop a new fake concept as a way to pitch it to the client because they know the client likes analogies. So it's okay, well, this is analogous to a bird. And it's client's wow, bird. Meanwhile, the design team's this has nothing to do with a bird. That was just a way of wrapping this thing to make it more palatable or interesting. And look, architecture is hard enough. So if you can get a good building done, it does have a concept to it, then that's probably the most important thing, maybe. But it does also irk me. It's I think you should give people at least a chance, though, and explain your actual thinking, your honest thinking in the project and why you think this is a good and valid direction conceptually, and give them that chance. And, I mean, it is true. Some clients, they just do not care. And at some point, you don't want to keep force feeding someone information if they don't care. But maybe it's the people that we attract. But I think you're right. Most people, if they're bothering to pay an architect, especially in the single family space, when they don't necessarily need to have an architect and they're choosing to, it means that they're interested.
I think also it's important to explain those things to clients, because I think a lot of people just think like, well, you know what to do, so it shouldn't take you very long, right? And like the whole like how much time it takes to design and think and come up with ideas is something that a lot of people don't have any idea of how that works, or how long it takes, or how painful or easy the process could be, right? So if we skip over that step, even like one slide in the presentation where we don't bother talking about the concept, I think it's hard for us to make them understand like our value and how we work, and therefore how much time we need to create those things.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it's kind of interesting too, because architecture and art are completely different things. But I think from an outsider's perspective, the concept design presentations and phases and the concepts could be seen more as an artist's kind of work, right? Because there's a curtain, right? And then what we're doing is weird and abstract, and people don't quite get it, and we produce these weird ideas, and therefore it occurs behind kind of a magic curtain of sorts, right? The same thing with an artist. It's like, how did they come up with that? I don't know. There's some magic in their brain or their being and their interpretation of the world that allows them to produce this art. I think the same kind of feeling can take place when clients are thinking about architects doing concept work. It's like, ooh, oh wow,
well,
a staple is the concept of the building. What does that mean?
No, but it's actually an interesting analogy with the arts, because in a way, I mean, even if we don't create arts as an artist would, we somehow create some form of art, I would still say. But the interesting thing about, again, like preserving the conceptual thinking throughout your life as an architect, I think is also a way to make you unique, right? Like your conceptual thinking is yours, right? Like it's your creative process, it's your creation, it's your personality, it's all of the things in your life that infiltrated your brain, and this is why you are proposing that and not somebody else, which again is what would make you the party you come up with and the process that led you to that party is the thing that would make you different from another architect who will work on that same project or will compete to get that same project.
Yeah.
And I think it's where you find yourself as an artist, as a creator, as a creative, you know, and just keeping that part is just not even giving you a chance to bring your own color to architecture.
I think that's an interesting way to think about to categorize good architecture versus bad architecture, and categorize the conceptual architects versus the non-conceptual architects is that way. It's actually very parallel to a thought I had just the other day of comparing contractors and architects. And because a lot of people get the two sort of confused, or they don't quite understand, like, why can't I just hire a contractor to design the building for me because they say they do, and all this kind of stuff. But here's how I thought about it. If you had three parallel universes, right, and in each of these universes, there's different contractors working on this project. So somehow you have this same project, but you have three different contractors complete it. If they're good contractors, it'll go exactly the same. It'll be close on schedule, close on budget. It's never perfect. The materials will be the same. It'll be the same, right? Because the peak performance of a good contractor is a known thing. We know the outcome, right? And so choosing between this high-end contractor, that high-end contractor, and another one, the results in the process, identical. Very, very close to it.
Well, the only difference would be one might be cheaper, one might be faster, and one might be doing cleaner work than the other two, you know?
No, but if they're all high-end, all the work is going to be clean. Like, what I'm saying is the pinnacle and the best version of contractor, let's say all these contractors are trying to be the best. The best version will be the same. It'll be the same version for all of them, right? Maybe their outfits are blue versus red, but it's the same exact thing. Versus if you hire three different architects, complete different outcomes. You could hire the three best architects in the world. However you decide that, three different outcomes. That's the difference, right? It's the uniqueness that you were talking about. Hire 10 architects, 10 different outcomes. And that is it's a very weird, radical thing to think, right? When you're a person choosing between architects, if you choose this route, you're going to go down a different reality. If you choose a contractor and you're choosing between three and they're all good, it's going to be the same, right?
You know, the other funny thing is that you could also hire that same architect at 3 different times in their career.
It'll be
the result will be different.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know what that means, but I think that when that doesn't exist for an architect anymore, then that's a problem. I don't think that's what it should be. I think it should be different every time. I think it should be this living thing that's dynamic, and you don't know what it's going to be until it's done, right? So I think, you know, the other reason why...
I mean, that's also what makes you irreplaceable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if you're just responding to constraint and you're just doing what you're being told to, then any AI could do that.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. So that's also why I think it's well. So the other reason why concepts are not really present in practice is because if you're the type of architect who prioritizes that, then your selling point to clients, your pitch, is hire me to do something cool, interesting, special, different, unique. I know all that stuff. What is it? I don't know. You just have to trust me to figure it out. And that's a much more difficult thing to say rather than, well, look at all these 10 blue houses I've done. I will do a blue house for you.
Yeah.
Be done on time and all that stuff. So it's just less common for that path to go down. And also gets to another question, which is not really for today's conversation, of like, how does one convince a client to hire them for something that they don't know what they're going to do yet? How do you convince someone that it's worth taking that risk, right?
Well, you have to find clients who are already taking risk on
I
things
agree.
in their life.
I agree.
You know?
But that's a difficult thing. I think that's also why it's less common in practice.
Yeah. I also wanted to touch on things that were said in the message from the listener.
Yeah.
They're saying that they did, I think, 2, 3, or 4 internships and they never noticed that.
Mm.
I could be completely wrong, but you also have to put the project back in context. I don't know how long these internships were.
Yeah.
And at what phase they started in the process, in the life of a project. But let's say you're an intern, you do a summer internship for a month, and the project is in DD, CD, construction. You've kind of missed the phase where the concept was brought in, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the concept is kind of inherent to the project. It doesn't get mentioned throughout the whole life of a project.
Yeah.
So I'm not defending the places where the internships were done, but I also want to be clear that it's not because you haven't seen it during the time you were in those offices that it does not exist.
Yeah, that's true. It's also one of the challenges when you transition from school to practice is that in school, the schedule of the project is so neat and tidy, and it's short, and every semester or quarter you start a new project, right? Oh, here it is, brand new project, brand new site. Fantastic. The sites are always phenomenal. Program's phenomenal. The brief's phenomenal. Everything's great. You've been given a project on a silver platter. Here's this perfect thing for you to do. In practice, those types of projects, they don't really, I mean, know that they exist, but they're really hard to come by. It reminds me, we had Josh Adlin on the show of Adlin Darling, and they were commissioned a few years ago now to design a meditative kind of wellness, reflective kind of space center for some university. And the program was just as a place to be. And it was in a really good site with trees and stuff. And I told him, I think on the recording, I said, well, that's a phenomenal brief. And he was like, I know, right? And that tells you someone who is as successful as they are, that they were beyond grateful and astonished. Oh my gosh, yes, I definitely want to do this. That kind of project exists all the time in school. It doesn't exist in practice.
But that I think has to do more with the type of building that you have to build for. You're not building a house, you're not building a library, you're building something that maybe only 10 architects in the world would build, right?
Yeah, no, but it is about the type of project. So what I'm saying is that for a lot of offices, not all, but for a lot of them, the majority of their projects won't necessarily be as cool as the briefs you get in school.
Yeah.
And so also as a result of that, and not an excuse, but as a result, it's easier for a practice to just kind of, again, just go through the steps and not kind of push the boundaries for something that on paper wouldn't seem interesting, which, by the way, I disagree with because I think everything could be interesting. But you said something else too, which is that, the concepts or the conceptual thinking might be there but not talked about. I think that's true too. So as you mature as an architect, there's a lot of things that you just tacitly know and understand. You don't really need to talk about them or express them. They're just there. And I think to a degree, this kind of conceptual material is part of that. I think it's still a mistake not to have it expressed, in writing or in drawing to keep everyone on track and things like this, but I think it does happen.
Well, I mean, the other thing too is that I think also when you are a student and you're doing those internships, you should, or even a young professional, you get out of school and start working, I think you should ask, the people who you work with about conceptual thinking, like what is there, and also kind of like make them excited about bringing it back or actually thinking about those things, because I think once you get into the real world, like you just get, dragged into this big wave of all the things you have to deal with for projects, and some people could lose track of those precious things. So I think maybe just reminding them of those things, that it exists and they're important and that they should maybe look into it. Especially coming from someone who's young and, fresh out of school, that has that excitement, I think could be a good thing.
I think it's a fantastic thing. And I agree. You just have to end up at a place where they're going to value that and not just... It's hard because it's really a both sides of the brain kind of practice.
But that's a very good point. Like if conceptual thinking is very key for you as a student or young graduate, you should be very careful as to which offices you end up working after you graduate. Not that you're going to stay there your whole life. Like you're probably hopefully going to move around and try different things. But if those things are important, don't become complacent to the place you decide to go work and lose that.
And the flip side, don't end up at a place where they just do competitions and architecture installations. I mean, that's cool if that's what you want to do with your life, but if you intend on doing buildings and you can't do that, that's also why it's very, very rare to find an office that does both buildings and also like things conceptually. Like they're not common. It's easy to be on the extremes of that spectrum. It's very easy to do architecture installations and talk about material research and stuff. It's important, but like it's not nearly as complex as trying to do that and making a building. That's the other thing too, is that translating academic concepts into building form for a real building that has all these other constraints is just difficult. Forget all the real world life factors of budgets and schedules and all that kind of stuff. Even all that stuff aside, right? Just like at your desk, taking a concept and then make it into a real building that makes sense is more difficult to do. So when I see student work as an example, right? I see some students who have their portfolios have no conceptual thinking, reject. I see some students who they have great conceptual thinking in their presentations and stuff, but all of their work is so hyper abstract and so detached from reality. I'm like, you excel at this thing, but you are in the outer rims of Jupiter with your stuff. And that's not a bad thing to have that, but there's no evidence that you can take that thinking and make it into something remotely real, right? Remotely real. I don't mean like, oh, hyper real and you need to have foundations with rebar. What's the rebar? I don't mean that. I mean remotely real. And that is the trick though, right? That's why a lot of students, their conceptual thinking work, they stay in the abstract realm. It's easy. I don't care how many jurors you have at SARC, who's on the panel. It's easy. Yeah. Making that into something that's closer to a real building, very, very difficult. Now, of course, we should have people who push the boundaries and all that stuff, but I think one should try and develop that skill set instead of just assuming like, well, I'm just going to only find like the 0.001% clients to allow me to do completely wacky things. Like I don't think as educators, I don't think that can be like our mode of thought. I think we need to produce people who will strive for that, but also a lot of people who can do still fairly radical buildings, but they're like can be done. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, how many of those students who have those types of projects, which we see all the time, make it to that level, as real life architects?
No, very few. And it has nothing to do even with them. It has to do with like just luck and timing and clients and all of these things too. So it's also, the conversation about concepts is a little bit difficult because the word concept is misused like crazy in architecture and in school. How many times I heard people say, this is my concept. I'm like, that's not a concept. That's a freaking material used throughout the project. My concept is brick, so I have brick everywhere. Okay, what does that have to do with the concept of brick though?
Yeah.
And so anyway, so this conversation is difficult unless you understand what that means. You should go back to a very early episode where we talked about how to develop a concept and what a concept is. But I think that's another issue. I also want to say that there's a difference between a parti and a concept. Mm-hmm. They're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. A parti is a formal proposition that outlines the formal gesture and the overall structure of the scheme. That's a parti. That's not a concept.
Concept is an idea.
A concept is an idea. They're different things. Yeah. I think that a parti is much less common to be actively discussed in a practice, and a good practice even, because if you have a bunch of good architects, they can see the parti tacitly or inherently, like you were saying before, right? You just see it. I know it's not right, because I can see that the parti is weak or there is not one. I don't need to draw it, right? Because it's there in my mind. I'm not saying we shouldn't draw it, but that's the thing too. There's kind of some of these things we don't have to express anymore internally. So that's another thing too. But parti and concept, different things.
Yeah.
I think the other reason why concepts are perhaps less common in practice is because even as a young designer or aspiring architect, there are so many things you have to learn that have to do with the more fun part of architecture as well, not just the boring stuff like budgets and construction technologies and waterproofing. Although waterproofing could be exciting, I suppose. But it's one of the big gaps that exists between school and practice is that
it's funny because people say that about waterproofing only when they're working on those waterproofing details, because they have to convince themselves it's exciting. But if you're not,
it's a tricky thing. But the principles are pretty basic. It's mostly just a very serious thing. That's the issue. Freaking water. What was I going to say? One of the gaps that exists between school and practice, as an architect and young architect, is the ability to produce just really attractive buildings, just really well detailed, attractive buildings and interiors and everything. Just make it really, really, really good.
Well, and that's the thing that I think.
But would you agree? I mean, like
no. I totally agree. There's so many ugly buildings out there and ugly interior spaces out there. Yeah. But it's interesting because I think we touched on that a little bit on another episode. The idea of like beauty and the importance of it could sound very superficial and this and that, but it doesn't have to be perceived superficially, and we cannot ignore it. We cannot say it's not important because we're surrounded by things. Mm-hmm. And if we're surrounded by things that are awful and ugly, imagine the life that we'll have, right? So the beauty in everything is crucial, and I do think that schools should find ways to teach that. And beauty could be said it's subjective. Yes, I mean there is different styles, different things that people will find beautiful or not beautiful. But still, like there is a baseline of what's ugly and what's not. Yeah. Right? Like it's like you look at people, right? I mean, there is different types of people. You're going to be attracted. No, but honestly, you're going to be...
Culturally, there's differences.
Yeah. And you're going to be attracted to different types of people. But ugly people, I think probably most people will agree on it. So it's the same with architecture, I feel
Interesting. I don't know if I would say that, but okay. Yeah, but so it takes practice and skill. It takes practice to achieve those skills, I should say. And it's just about refining details and understanding composition and all of these things. And so for a lot of students, that takes place in the professional setting, because in school, again, you don't get to that level of detail. It's more of a conceptual, like what's your idea and does your building convey your idea, right? And then what other issues does your building have that are maybe more functional? But the just pure aesthetics is not really talked about in school, but it definitely exists in the real world. And I think also, again, it's another piece of that the Project Pi that exists, that a lot of attention goes toward, and it's very easy to let that kind of occupy the space that conceptual thinking should.
Yeah, and actually maybe it might not even be about beauty. It might be more about harmony.
Okay.
Right? Because...
two sides of the same coin. What's going on here? What's harmony?
No, but well, again, because beauty means, like a sensibility to things, which could vary depending on the people, right?
Okay.
You're sensible to something or you're not. You find this beautiful or you're not, but this person might, right? So there's different variations.
That person's wrong, by the way.
But when things are harmonious, it might not necessarily be the thing you would go for, but you would look at it and be like, it's somewhat beautiful because it's harmonious. Mm-hmm. Which actually made me think about, like let's say the Greeks and, the proportion, the orders, right? The, the scale of things. Like, for example, classical buildings, I wouldn't say they're beautiful. They're complicated and very ornate and maybe therefore and old, and they made it through time. So maybe that's why we think they're beautiful. Mm. Or are they beautiful because they're harmonious in their proportion, their use of material, the language that they created, I'm thinking maybe that's how schools should be approaching teaching beauty or teaching harmony, is going back to basically geometry, and making sure that things could work together, are well proportioned, are well drawn, like just, I don't know.
you just don't know what?
No, but I do think that's kind of been lost. I mean, like Corbu and his
5 principles.
His 5 principles,
5
or like his the modular, like
the man
with the different proportion, like again back to the Greeks and the size of things and how they were looking at perspective to make it look a certain way when you're standing in front of the building. Like this is more of a geometrical approach to design, which I feel like it's been completely lost in architecture school. Like they teach you, during my time, they were teaching, perspective drawings, 2-point, 3-point perspective drawings, and more like artsy form of modeling, right? Modeling with clay, doing charcoal drawings, doing this and that. But the technical aspect of let's say like designing a beautiful facade, right? Doesn't have to do with how expensive the material is. It's like, no, you have to understand the harmony, the composition, the scale.
Yeah, this so this is slightly different from the main point of the conversation, but I agree entirely. So I was just speaking with someone the other day who's an educator, and it's I think that architecture schools in general, the ones I've been exposed to, are really struggling to find their path. I think I'm very, very critical of most academic institutions and what they're teaching, because there's only 2 things you find in school. Either they're hyper-conceptual, which is important, but that's all it is, or the extremely, extremely pragmatic, let's learn about weatherproofing today, and let's learn about like the sustainability solar panels and where they go, and that's it. And the fucking middle is gone. Like, okay, but what about the part where someone actually designs a building? And of course, I know we have to question what a building is, absolutely, but still, a building, there's some physical presence to the building. It exists. It's for people. It's on a site. Design the building. Yeah. All this fancy, conceptual, abstract, CMYK, big board stuff, all this hyper-technical wall sections that they don't know what they're drawing, really. Where's the middle? Where's the fucking building, man?
I mean, the fact that, students are hardly pushed to, to learn like BIM software. Again, you're learning a very, very technical program for a project
that you don't understand,
for which you're only looking at the conceptual phase, at the 5% of the life of a project. But we plug in this super complicated skill that you're supposed to learn and know everything about. Makes no sense at all.
And by the way, most of the BIM programs, they're designed for the CD phase, which is multiple phases after concept design.
I know.
Yeah.
And the thing is, so you're supposed to know the software, again, before you understand how to compose anything, how to hand a pencil and make sure that you can come up with something that is harmonious, is beautiful, and you understand every single line you're drawing on a page. It makes no sense at all to me. Like somehow, talking about this specific topic, technology infiltrated the academic brain of architecture schools and just kind of like sipped into all of the cracks there.
I could almost see it as being that there's a what do you call it? Like one of those, a scale,
pendulum?
A pendulum scale, like the teeter-totter, whatever, the two sides thing. That one side, this is our hypothesis. One side has like all the technical stuff, and the other side, as a response, is hyper-conceptual, and they're balanced on both ends, and they balance out. But they don't really balance out because it's not a balancing act. There's like a middle ground again of like, how do you take your thinking and make it into a building, and then how does that building perform? And the center part is the bulk of the work. It's the hard part too. I mean, that's also actually gets back to what I was saying about student work. I see a lot of student work, very good here. I guess sort of good here based on whatever things they're showing. I don't know if they actually drew them, but they're good on the technical side. But where's like the building? Where's the building that had that at least attempts to tie these two things together? And schools now, they just don't do that. And they have teachers who don't teach it. They have teachers who don't know how to do architecture. They have teachers who understand wall sections. And they have teachers who understand like generative robotic, whatever abstract stuff, but there's and history. But there's no fucking teacher in the middle who actually knows what it means to design a building. And that no one's teaching that, and it's crazy. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, because I know people like Barbara Besser, who's regarded as a very, very good architect and a sensible person and a nice person. She, amongst many other people, believe that too. Where is the building?
But that's the problem too with like who goes into teaching in those schools and what they're being hired for. And everybody has to pick a specialty and like their little shtick, and that's why they get hired. Therefore, that's what the curriculum becomes. It becomes about the interests of that specific person, which is the hyper-focus, topic that they've decided to make everybody look at. Rather than schools being like, okay, I'm interested in hiring 10 teachers and I want them just to be like basic great architects, and not necessarily want to do crazy weird things with their students. Just be good architects. They run good practices, they believe in those things, they do good buildings, and those are the people who should be teaching architecture. And maybe throw in a couple of sprinklers of those special people who have kind of weird interests, because you need to add spices to the mix. But the problem is the mix is made with too many sprinkles. And there is no gook in between to tie it together. I mean,
yeah. And I also want to clarify too that it's funny. I know in this conversation when we talk about you design a building, that all of the conceptual people are like, "What is a building? Oh, building, boring, doors and windows. It's so complacent. So what's the word? Conventional, right?" And the other people who are technical, well, we are doing buildings because the buildings are composed of insulation and studs and structures and rebar and concrete. And it's both of you are missing the point, though, right? Yeah. It's when we say building, I just mean, again, some kind of physical structure that relates to the site, the people that are using it, the culture, does relate to environment, does relate to the program, feels good to be in, makes a statement about architecture, does all of these things that we all want it to do. But none of you are willing to take the risk of fighting that fight.
Yeah.
You want to stay in your comfort zone and just profess that well, robotics and VRs, this is very interesting stuff. I'm like, ooh, yes it is. But again, like you said, there a few sprinkles amongst the goo.
And it's a disservice to the students, because at the end of the day, they come out of school and they're like, well, what the fuck is this real world about? I thought these were all sprinkles and it's just gook,
Yeah.
It also goes to the types of projects that you see in portfolios these days. It's those massive structures and things that students can't even comprehend, because even as a professional working on those giant projects, it's very difficult to comprehend, right? And I'm like, none of them have just a small
core
structure, even just a house scale or a small multifamily scale, just 4 units, and you're looking at it in a very hyper intense way to consider those things. How can you jump from not missing that step to look at hundreds of units or thousands of millions of square footage? I don't understand.
So what's interesting is that I think for the students who have that type of background or experience, when they get into the practice, a lot of them only go one of two routes. They either stay in the conceptual realm and do like architecture installations, or when they actually are finally tasked with, okay, here's a multifamily structure. We have at the first floor, some commercial stuff, and there's a parking garage underneath and whatever else. Or let's say it's something that has even more flexibility. Here's a house, a high-end house on a hillside. Budget's almost unlimited. Draw me a house. And they just don't know what to do, and they default to drawing the most basic, preconceived, conventional thing because they've never been trained on how to rip that shit apart and actually make architecture that combines the necessities of architecture with the conceptual thinking. That's the problem. So the other thing I'll see in a lot of student portfolios is that it's only those two things, or rather, I should say that it's the conceptual stuff, and they have actual architecture. It's terrible architecture.
Yeah.
Proportions aren't right. Function doesn't make sense. Graphically doesn't make sense. Compositionally it doesn't look good. Okay, forget about the feasibility of structurals and all that stuff. It just doesn't look good. It's just bad, and it's because the two never merged.
Yeah.
And you get into practice, you have to learn it on your own. And actually, for myself, when I transitioned from school, I had to very intentionally, I told myself, actually, like quite consciously, I'm going to work very hard on refining and developing and furthering my compositional skills. And going back to the subject of beauty, let's say, or aesthetics or whatever, just like making it look good. And I'm going to have some conceptual thinking too for myself. Offices I worked at didn't really care, but I have to have it for myself. But I want to make it look good. I'm going to practice that because I had some of that in school, but not as much as I would have wanted, which also is inherent to the nature of school, I think. But it kind of took that. Like I had to think and make it a point to learn that. And I think for students too, if you don't, I don't know where you learn it if the schools aren't teaching it, which mostly they are not.
In the idea of making students resilient and appealing to employers, like stop giving them those gigantic buildings to design, give them a mix of things. Like they might end up working for a small office who only does single family home. Those projects are irrelevant. They never develop the skill. They actually don't even understand scale. They don't even understand how like a small program works well together. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's just like the teachers or the school wanted to be so impressive and have this, students work on the biggest projects and do the biggest, coolest graphic, and it's like, stop that bullshit. No one cares.
Or on the flip side, it's all the programs they need to know. But that's what I'm saying, though. That's what happens when you have a bunch of academics and educators who would never practice. Because anyone who practices, that there's this middle ground that you have to go through.
Yeah.
You have to put pen to paper. You have to show walls or your version of a wall, whatever that is. You have to show thickness. You have to choose materials. There's all this stuff you have to do to have it be built. And that's you have to go through it. And
that's also why a lot of students struggle on those projects because
they just don't know what to do.
I remember when I was in school, looking back actually, we incrementally went working on projects from bigger and bigger scale as the years were moving up. Mm-hmm. Which looking back taught me a lot because you understand things from a very small scale and very like human scale, and then you feel more comfortable moving up, and expanding on that. But if you're thrown onto a project that's gigantic and you don't know the basic principles and you have no understanding of what it means to be a human living in those structures, how could you even come up with something that makes sense?
It almost feels to me that if I think about a 5-year program, what's being taught is first-year stuff and fifth-year stuff, but the third and fourth and years are missing. First year is basic kind of what do you call it, motor skills or motor skills, and conceptual thinking. What the hell does that mean? And then working with raw space. Everyone does some kind of like, again, meditative abstract bathhouse cube thing, right? That's like first year stuff. That's great. And then fifth year is where you blow the world up.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a human in this century, in the future? And it's hyper conceptual again, but on a kind of extreme degree, and you're questioning society and all that stuff. Great. And a lot of those projects end up being more theoretical, which I'm perfectly okay with. The middle, though, years 3 and 4 is when you should be building buildings, and that part is just the meat is not there. Marina.
No, and
meat
again,
is
it
missing
goes back to like,
from the
an
sandwich.
architect's career. Like if you look at most offices who design towers today, they didn't start with designing towers. They warmed up with other types of projects before they got to design towers. So it, again, makes no sense to me that you would give a student the most complicated project in school before they even got through the other ones. Like, I don't know.
And the thing too is that even the greater danger, I think, is the greater danger beyond the lack of skills that's being taught in school and the lack of skills that graduates have is the lack of interest. That's the bigger problem.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to train somebody who has bits and pieces, train them on the rest. But if they're not interested because they've never been exposed to it, then that's a huge risk. And that's a huge problem for the profession also, right? Because unless you've attempted to do that middle part that we're talking about, like put pen to paper, like actually do a building, unless you at least attempt it a couple of times, you don't know if it's for you.
No.
You know what I mean? That's also probably why there's one of the reasons that people don't end up doing architecture, because they've realized that the profession is different and they've like, okay, well, this wasn't like school, so I don't want to do it. And it's mostly to do with other things, I think, not what I'm describing, but I think that's part of it, right? So like, I don't know when I'm talking to a student if they will actually be good at doing a building. And again, more fundamentally, are they even interested in that?
Yeah.
Because they've never tried. They were never given an opportunity to. All right. So what else? Is there anything else with this? Why conceptual thinking and concepts and parties happen in school but not in practice? I think we covered a lot of it.
I think we did. If we missed anything, listeners can let us know.
Yeah. Got exciting at the end. There's spice it up, baby. Okay, give us an outro.
Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please support the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcast. You can subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. We also have the website where all of the episodes are available, secondstudiopod.com. We are on Instagram, sometimes Facebook, and of course we have the hotline 213-222-6950. You can call, leave a voicemail, send a text message if you have any questions like the listener that we just answered to, or anything you want to suggest, any topics, any guests you want to see, reach out.
Did you cover it all? I wasn't listening.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.